What does it actually mean to be centered? To go from being this wobbly piece of clay to something that is still in my hands. Watch how my hands bump and move when the clay comes. This is Maggie, my buddy and my companion, who gets very sad when I'm not paying attention to her. For me, being centered, what I want you to pay attention to is just where my hands are, how they reach in and bring up the clay. Really, what I'm doing is just bringing up any of that unevenness to the surface so that we can deal with it one stage at a time. And as I bring my hands back down, the piece gets more and more still because it's becoming more and more aligned within itself. Being a centered self, why I chose that name for my practice, is because this is really what we do in ourselves. We're taking all of the things that have thrown at us, our histories, our emotions, those things that we often don't want to talk about, and we're dealing with them one at a time in therapy, trying through relationship with our therapist to start to center ourselves. And in these moments, it doesn't matter what's happening in your background. When you feel centered, you start to realize that nothing else really matters. Anything can happen in the background, but as long as we're still in ourselves, we can really cope with whatever's happening around us. Even Maggie paying attention to other people walking around. Look at the clay now. Look how still it is. You can see how fast the wheel is moving, and yet if you were to look at the clay itself, it feels still. That's when we know that we can start making a pot. So many people, and especially amateur potters, want to feel like a piece is centered well before it is. They don't understand that that stillness is essential, and the process of centering happens in every stage of making a pot. And in my practice as a therapist, I see this too. I see my clients wanting to just jump in and feel like they can just get solved right away. Don't we all? The empathy I have for that is huge. And yet at the same time, it is these small steps that mean that we are able, through centering constantly, to allow ourselves room to grow. My hands don't leave the pot. They're with it as we're thinning out the walls. As a potter, I've come to learn that every stage of making a pot is actually still a process of centering it. Watching me bring up the walls, the piece is going to start getting thinner, which means that my hands cannot leave it in any kind of abrupt fashion. They need to be able to constantly have almost a dance with the sponge of getting it wet enough for it to be able to slide through my hands and yet dry enough so it doesn't become waterlogged. And I bring up the piece, slowly, controlled, starting to feel it take shape, and coning it back to make sure that we can create that cylinder we're going for. We're making a mug today. And centering the top. As you notice my sponge start to really grab a hold of what's happening just at the bottom. What I'm doing is I'm bringing up that excess clay, bringing it up and getting the piece to rise with my hands. And getting out the excess water. And the dance continues. Putting some more just to make sure that the walls feel moist. And you'll watch as I start to pick up a piece of clay and bringing it all the way up that piece, getting it taller and taller and taller. That wobble's normal right now. As the piece gets taller, it actually gets a bit more fragile. As it gets taller, it gets thinner. And this is where coning happens again. Making sure that I'm recentering that piece and bringing it all the way up. Again, the background doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what's happening behind me. All that matters as a potter is me and this piece. In our work with ourselves, it is this centeredness, this centered self that I strive for in my practice. To be a centered self means to allow ourselves to grow, even when it feels vulnerable to do so. Knowing that we have a base to come back to, knowing that we're going to have wobbles that hit us. I mean, how can't we? And it's in this way we get to start to take shape. I'm making a pot belly right now. And as I make that pot belly, you'll notice the piece kind of almost shrinks down. It's a quintessential mug I'm making, one of my favorites. It almost looks like a vase, but eventually I'll put on a handle and I'll trim the piece down. Looks huge now, doesn't it? Indeed it does, but it usually shrinks about 10% in the kiln. So even now, you'll notice I'm still centering. There was a wobble just there as I was coning the piece in. And when I was collaring it, I noticed it, so I had to just go right back and recenter. Even when we feel like we're getting shaped, we can still have things that kind of throw us off. And watch again, the collaring happens again. And take a long time to get to this spot in ourselves where we feel like we're actually taking shape. And how much farther have we gone from that lump that we first saw? But one of the most incredible parts of my work is realizing that this can actually happen. We can actually become a centered self. And we can become beautiful. This mug is not done yet. You'll notice me trimming off the excess, but it'll need to be trimmed. It'll need to be leather hard to do that, and then the handle will come onto it. Then it'll go into the bisque kiln. Then it'll get glazed. Then it'll go into the glaze kiln, and then it'll be done. It's a 4-part step to making a mug. Takes a long time, but it's worth it.